Okay, I'm moving now to a section on close reading. I'll start by reading a quotation from a novel that you may have read or perhaps seen in adapted form, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The speaker is the clergyman Mr. Collins in a letter to Mr. Bennet. As I read, see what you make of the passage. What words seem important or difficult, or both? Are there any technical terms that would be appropriate to use? What's the tone of the passage? And what does it say about the speaker? I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficence has preferred to me the valuable rectory of the parish, where it shall be my endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it is as a duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families, within the reach of my influence, and on these grounds I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable, and that the circumstances of my being next in the entail of Longbourn estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologise for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends, but of this hereafter. I've chosen this passage because, on the face of it, it's not a particularly exciting one. There are other passages in Pride and Prejudice, perhaps other more famous ones, that are more obviously richer and denser. And it certainly doesn't offer us the sort of depth of imagery that you might find in a Shakespeare sonnet or in a novel by Virginia Woolf, for example. There isn't a rich tapestry of metaphor and simile here. But there's still a lot to be said about it. Even bearing in mind the formal requirements of letter writing in the late 18th century, this is pompous and periphrastic, which means that he talks about things in a roundabout manner. Collins makes his points in an excessively lengthy fashion, and that suggests the excessive importance he attaches to his own words. There is no need, for example, for bounty and beneficence, rites and ceremonies. Beg leave to apologise for it. These phrases are all tautologists, that is, that they contain different words or phrases that basically mean the same thing. Collins also gives detail that is unnecessary for his meaning, but which serves to emphasise, as he sees it, his own importance. He doesn't need Right Honourable Lady Catherine. He doesn't need valuable rectory. Austen's irony is important here too. Some of Collins's words have a double meaning of which he is unaware, but which disclose significant aspects of his personality to us and to the other characters. Patronage refers literally and precisely to the right of presenting a member of the clergy to a particular ecclesiastical benefice or living. So Collins is living as a rector. But it also has connotations of patronising, which are borne out when we discover how much emphasis Lady Catherine places on her own rank. By demean myself, Collins simply means to behave. But demean also has connotations of lowering or humbling, suggesting that Collins is excessively obsequious, excessively flattering to those of higher rank. Similarly, flatter myself means to encourage or to cheer up, but flatter has other connotations of complimenting excessively, suggesting both Collins's undue sense of his own importance and his linked willingness to suck up to those he thinks are even more important than him. The only metaphor in the passage suggests this too. Collins refers to the olive branch, a classical symbol of peace, which even by the 18th century had become something of a cliché. Collins suggests that the Bennets may dislike him because he will inherit the Longbourn estate when Mr. Bennet dies. He implies that he is seeking to make peace with them for disinterested reasons, and that they should be grateful to him, and that's what the olive branch metaphor is doing. But actually, we soon discovered that his motives are much more selfish than that. I move on now to talk about critical thinking in relation to that passage. By close reading the passage, we've said some interesting things about Collins's character. We've started thinking about his role in the rest of the novel. But we can go further than this. Critical thinking, using literary theory, can help us here. This quotation is from Jonathan Culler's Literary Theory, a very short introduction. Theory is an attempt to show that what we take for granted as common sense is in fact a historical construction, a particular theory that has come to seem so natural to us that we don't even see it as a theory. As a critique of common sense and exploration of alternative conceptions, theory involves a questioning of the most basic premises or assumptions of literary study, the unsettling of anything that might have been taken for granted. What is meaning? What is an author? What is it to read? What is the I or subject who writes, reads, or acts? How do texts relate to the circumstances in which they are produced? And we can extrapolate some questions from Culler's questions that we can then ask of the novel and of this particular passage. For example, we might want to think about who is the speaker of this passage. Is it Collins? Is it Austen, the author? Is it the narrator of Pride and Prejudice, who we shouldn't confuse with Austen herself? Is it Mr. Bennet, who is actually reading out the letter? So we've got 4 different speakers there. And clearly, they're all sort of coalescing at this moment in the novel. But quite what the relationship is between those 4 speakers is quite complicated and might take a certain amount of unpacking and thought. Collins' letter is in the first person, I said, I did, etc. But the narrative of Pride and Prejudice as a whole is in the third person, he said, she did. Theorists of the novel have often been fascinated by its capacity to contain multiple voices. And a word sometimes used for that is heteroglossia, meaning something like many languages or a multiplicity of different languages. But languages not in the terms of English, French, German or whatever, but as it were, languages or dialects within a particular language that suggest different forms of character, different ways of thinking about the world. What one sees in Austen, actually, is how very minor discrepancies between different characters' languages can actually show major differences between the characters, but also between their sort of ideological preoccupations and assumptions. That's something that Austen's very good at, and you see that in this letter and the way in which the Bennets respond to this letter. None of the Bennets would ever have written a letter quite like that, even though, in terms of their social background and some of their assumptions, they're actually very close to Collins. On that subject, who is the reader here? Is it me? Is it you? Or is it actually the Bennets? They're listening to Mr. Bennet reading Collins' letter at that moment in the novel. And they're actually very careful, close readers themselves. And they go on to construct an analysis of Collins' letter. And one of the things they do in that is shed light on its absurdities. Mr. Bennet is a very likeable figure, I think. And it's likely we might sympathise with his desire to mock Collins and to mock the way in which Collins writes. But it's important to note that, just moving on a few pages into Pride and Prejudice, the narrator reminds us that the clergyman, that Collins, is a victim of bad parenting. Bennet's easy assumption of superiority over Collins might tell us something about his own complacency, his refusal to discharge his paternal responsibilities, and later in the novel, his lack of responsibility for his daughters leads to the chaotic behaviour of Lydia and Jane. So Austen's not just ironising Collins through how he writes, but she's also ironising Mr. Bennet through how he reads. Collins foolishly imagines that the Bennets will be grateful readers. And that helps us think about the way in which all texts imagine a certain sort of reader, what critics sometimes call an implied reader. So Austen is imagining a reader responding to the Bennets, who themselves are responding to a letter by Collins, which of course is embedded in a narrative that's presented by a narrator who isn't the same as the historical Austen. So there are some interesting layers there of reading and interpretation that are quite difficult, I think, to get one's head around and require a certain amount of consideration. And of course, as 21st century readers, we might have very different attitudes to the ones that Austen would have assumed of her own readers, and that's something I'll talk about in a few seconds. Another question might be the effects of genre and the sort of assumptions that creates in its readership. Austen is writing a text of a particular type, the late 18th century sentimental novel or romance. And like any genre, that involves certain patterns and conventions, as does the formal letter that Collins is writing. So finding out more about the history of these genres might help us to understand what these texts are doing better. It's not just a matter of disclosing character. There's actually a sort of structural logic of genre going on here as well. Another way of thinking about this text, and it might seem like rather a perverse way, is to think about what this text isn't saying. And that's something that a lot of critics are interested in, perhaps largely due to the influence of psychoanalysis. So in psychoanalytical therapy, the therapist is interested in what the patient isn't able consciously to admit, the things that might manifest themselves in certain ways, in certain neurotic tics or whatever. Some literary critics focus on this idea of repression in literary texts. What do characters not say and what do texts not say? What can texts not talk about? Austen, for all kinds of reasons, finds it very difficult to talk consciously about sex. And yet one of the things that Collins is saying in this letter is, I want to sleep with one of your daughters. And one perhaps could work with that idea and think about, as critics have, think about the way in which sex is implied or presented or repressed in Austen's novels. And that brings me on to the subject of gender and relates to Culler's final question about historical circumstances. A lot of critics have argued that history is not simply background or context to literary texts, but actually crucial, embodied in literary texts, and crucial for understanding how literature constructs the world. And a historical approach to the Collins quotation might think about the word entail, which for me is an absolutely key term in the novel as a whole. It means here the settlement of the succession of a landed estate. So Collins will inherit the estate if Bennet dies and if his daughters are unmarried. Austen's novels ultimately may not actually be about romance at all. They may not really be love stories, but they may be about the way in which male power is consolidated or redistributed through the ownership of property. Women are more than simply pawns in this process. Austen, of course, is celebrated for her creation of independently minded heroines like Eliza Bennet. But her novels nevertheless reflect on the severe restrictions placed on women's actions and their decisions in what's a highly male-dominated society. And I think that really important context is demonstrated by Collins's letter. I'll finish now with a few concluding remarks. So thinking about literary texts may involve questioning our own assumptions about them, and perhaps our own assumptions about gender or about power or about reading or whatever. And I'll finish by adding two more to Culler's list of questions. What is literature? And who decides how we should define it? The last 25 years or so have seen strong critical interest in the relationship between literature and history, as I was saying. And one effect of this has been an increased awareness of the difficulty of distinguishing between the literary and the non-literary. People are more and more aware that those sort of distinctions are problematic and the result of ideological processes that have led to the exclusion of many interesting writers and genres from academic study. And you still see that, I think, especially in reviewing in the broadsheet newspapers. There's often a lot of snobbery about science fiction or about thrillers or whatever, as well as if they could never be quite as meaningful, never be quite as valid as literary fiction. And yet, if one thinks about the history of science fiction, some of the most powerful and important texts in the history of European civilization have been works of science fiction. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being a good example. So, one of the things I think that's been happening to university study in the last 20 or so years is an increasing flexibility and variety of texts that students come across. So, at university, you would come across some familiar names, Shakespeare, Austen, Dickens, and so on. But you'll also find that courses you take will reflect this increasing capaciousness of literature as a category. So you might read popular fiction or travel writing or political tracts or fairy tales or scientific works or personal essays and so on. They're all texts and you can do interesting things with them. You just have to be sensitive to genre as well at the same time. So for me, the most exciting thing about studying English literature at university is the opportunity to engage with all kinds of different texts and ideas and to be part of a discipline that is always evolving and questioning its foundational assumptions. One final point. If you go on to study English literature at university, you will no doubt want to do well in your assessments, eventually to gain a good degree and to get a good job. And that's perfectly understandable. But the way to do well is not to be obsessed by those outcomes, but instead to immerse yourself in the processes of learning. You will encounter a wide variety of interesting, fertile approaches to literary texts, and it's ultimately up to you to find your own ways of engaging with the material and sort of mapping out your own progress through the degree. And that, for me, is what makes literary studies so stimulating, exciting, and sometimes fun, the freedom and inventiveness of reading and writing.